Welcome to the Center for Audit Quality's Profession in Focus on Risk Assessment and Scoping in the COVID-19 environment. I'd like to thank Christine Davine and Yulia Gurman for joining me today. And now I'd like to turn it over to our guests to introduce themselves. Christine, let's start with you.
Thank you, Yuri, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here today. I am Christine Davine, and for Deloitte's audit practice, I'm the National Managing Partner of our Professional Practice Network, which consists of our quality, our risk, and our regulatory functions.
Glad to have you joining us here today, Christine. Next, I'd like to ask Yulia to introduce herself.
Thanks, Yuri. Delighted to be here today. My name is Yulia Gurman. I serve as Executive Director of Internal Audit and Corporate Security for Packaging Corporation of America. We're a domestic manufacturer of corrugated products. I've been in internal audit profession for over 15 years now and served in the role in different industries, including retail, real estate, and manufacturing. Happy to share my perspectives here today. Thanks.
Thank you, Christine and Yulia. So let's dive right in. Christine, there's been discussion in the industry recently around materiality in the COVID-19 environment of economic uncertainty, and in many cases, declining operating results. Can you summarize for our audience your observations as to how COVID-19 has impacted management's assessment of materiality?
Sure, thank you for the question, Yuri. First, I want to just mention there is no new materiality guidance. Changes aren't considered necessary because the guidance is flexible as it's currently written, and it does contemplate a changing environment, which in this case would include COVID. So what's important to focus on and what's currently considered is a focus on the important metrics to the users of the financial statements, which of course includes investors and changes in investor expectations. It's also important to focus on adjustments to or normalizations of benchmarks. And then further, you want to focus on both quantitative factors and qualitative factors that contemplate a company's specific events and their specific industry considerations. Now, when management applies the quantitative and qualitative factors in determining what's material in the current year, they would consider the impact that COVID has on current operating results and on future results. And then this in turn flows through to any potential impact on the precision of internal controls over financial reporting. Now, you use the same starting point for the determination of what is material for both the financial statements and for ICFR. A common question we've been hearing quite a bit is, how do you consider declining operating results when you're making your materiality assessment? In some situations, it may be appropriate to adjust the financial statement metric for recorded unusual or infrequent events. An example of that might be a restructuring charge or an impairment charge. But generally, it's not considered appropriate to use pro forma financial statement metrics that might adjust for the current and expected macroeconomic downturn itself. An example of that would be attempting to average a current year profitability metric, such as profit before tax or EBITDA, with that prior year's metric.
Thank you, Christine. And now that we understand what management might be considering, let's turn to the auditor. Can you describe some of the considerations auditors might be facing as they determine materiality in this environment?
I can address that one fairly quickly because auditors generally follow a similar process to management's, which I just described. PCAOB standards include the same reference to both quantitative and qualitative factors to set materiality during planning and to assess the impact of errors. You just heard me discuss how to consider declining operating results and how you can potentially adjust your financial statement metric for unusual items. But I also do want to discuss addressing reconsideration of the actual financial statement metric that's used to determine materiality. And this is another situation that has become more common from COVID. For example, if a profit-related metrics like PBT, profit before tax, is nominal or it's in a loss position, they may not be appropriate measures of materiality. And there are situations even where after you adjust for an unusual item, a profitability-based metric might still be negative, or it could still be nominal. In that case, it would no longer be appropriate to use that metric as a basis for materiality. So we do expect to have more situations where auditors and management will need to look at other financial statement metrics to establish materiality. And to help figure out what metric to use, you can take a look towards management reporting and analyst report to see what metrics they are using to consider current year results. If they're looking to a different financial statement measure or potentially future profitability, this could mean that current profitability measures may no longer be the most relevant, and that prior metric then may no longer provide evidence of what are the most important metrics in this current environment. We have generally found that when we needed to change the financial statement metric used for the reasons that I just described, materiality is lower than the prior year, which does make sense if you think about it, as the change was really driven by depressed operating results. So going forward, it will be important to consider if the current year changes are temporary or whether they're expected to recur.
Thank you, Christine. So Yulia, let's move on to scoping and risk assessment. How has COVID-19 impacted the internal auditor's risk assessment and ultimately ICFR scoping, if at all?
Absolutely. It has been certainly a unique year, and internal audit not excluded. In March, when we switched to remote environment and realized it may be a while, we had to rethink our risk assessment and audit approach and switch to more flexible and more frequent assessment, given that the business environment was changing so quickly and we were not certain how current our information may be at any point in time. We also approached our control owners and made sure that we understood any COVID restrictions and implications on the controls that they have to perform. And we worked together to identify alternative solutions for those impacted, but also made sure that we stayed very coordinated with our external auditors to make sure that our approach and alignment made sense and provided enough coverage for our external auditors as well as internal audit perspective. From control owner perspective, and as part of their 302 certifications, very important for them to disclose what type of modifications and alternative procedures were performed so that we can understand, again, the control environment and adequate coverage of the controls. Now, from internal audit perspective specifically, we, like most of us, had to switch to remote auditing, which we have not done before. And we had to come up with a quick and workable approach on getting to the locations virtually. And again, I mentioned we're a domestic manufacturer. We have many locations that we typically cover. So we worked with the locations to come up with a workable approach and still get the coverage we needed, which actually worked out really well for us over the last 6 or 7 months or so. And then I think one other point I wanted to make is that throughout this year, we realized that the importance of communication and really staying coordinated with management and external audit and working through all the challenges together is what really made it work for us. So flexibility is really the key, and being able and kind of open for new ways of doing things, including remote inventory observations that are coming up. So that's something else we're working on right now.
Thank you, Yulia. Christine, any additional observations or recommendations from an external audit perspective when we think about COVID-19 impacts on risk assessment or multi-location scoping, including scoping of the financial statement audit?
Risk assessment really underpins our audit, and it also directly influences how we consider our multi-location scoping. COVID clearly has impacted. COVID impacts have resulted in new or changed risks for many companies. Fraud risk and manipulation of financial results from declining operations is one of the biggest risks in today's environment. Also, we've seen increased risk from going concern, increased risk from valuation, and impairments as well. And sometimes these risks reside at certain locations or business units, and that could be for a number of reasons. For example, the business unit could be impacted from where it's located in the world, or it could be because its activities have been impacted by COVID. If the risks are significant to the audit, this may likely mean including those locations in the scope of the audit and performing audit procedures to address those risks. And that could then directly translate into requesting auditors that are in country to perform work for the consolidated audit. And maybe this wasn't what was planned initially as part of the scope of the audit. We've also seen the impact of COVID on how group engagement teams or principal auditors interact and communicate with their component auditors, particularly for companies that have high COVID cases that are in a work from home mode. In some circumstances, this has limited the ability of the principal auditor to be able to physically get out and visit locations and meet with the auditors or the local company management. But this wouldn't eliminate the need for the principal auditor to direct and supervise their component auditors. We've also considered other actions like remote reviewing and enhanced communications via phone or video chat to round out our supervision and review activities. In some instances, group engagement teams have found that they're able to perform audit procedures themselves rather than to have to use the other auditors. And this would be highly dependent on the IT structure and the company's control environment and whether the group engagement team can get access to the books and records that they need to perform the audit procedures. It's important to remember that in upcoming year-end audits, it's crucial to make sure to perform a very thorough risk assessment. With the rapidly changing environment, a risk assessment that's performed earlier in the year likely needs to be updated at year-end. And finally, there's no one size fits all here. We need to do a thorough consideration of how the current environment impacts the risks for a specific company. As auditors, we should understand how management has thought about these risks, considering the risks that we identify, which will clearly help us identify gaps in processes or controls.
Interesting observations, Christine. So maybe moving on, Yulia, I know internal audit departments often have a scope that extends beyond the financial statement or internal control audits. Are there any other particular areas of focus for internal audit departments that you have observed in light of the heightened risk environment that we find ourselves in as a result of the pandemic?
Absolutely, and I think this is a topic where, as Christine mentioned, it's different for every company, depending on what kind of business they have and risks. But a couple of perspectives from my own observations and my peers is there has been a lot of shift and focus on looking at the IT environment, especially given that all of a sudden most people switch to remote learning, understanding the IT security, cybersecurity controls, as well as the phishing attacks. A lot of companies perform phishing exercises to make sure that we are providing awareness to employees and being careful with those types of attacks. Another area where we performed more work this year is data analytics. As being remote, this is our tool to go and see any potential red flag or indicators of potential fraud or just higher risk areas that we really need to be focusing on, and helping us, as Christine mentioned, rethink our risk assessment approach and identify new areas that were not necessarily on a high radar before COVID happened to us. And then I think the third area that a lot of internal audit shops identified is really helping management and business where help is needed. So you really kind of take your internal audit hat off and really step in and help with specific business areas. And I know it's always a gray area. So as internal auditors, we should remember that independence is still important. So if we perform some business and management roles, we have to make sure that we segregate independence and segregate those individuals from performing specific audit work in those areas in the near future.
Thank you, Yulia. Definitely some good reminders in there for auditors to consider, as we move into year end for calendar year reporting companies. So Christine, in light of all these observations that we have heard here today, what should those charged with governance be focused on when it comes to risk assessment in the COVID-19 environment?
Thank you for the question. Those charged with governance and a company's management want to consider the broad implications of COVID on internal controls. And this would include the ability to timely complete the financial reporting process and to prepare the financial statements. They should also consider if the controls are still operating effectively. In the COVID environment, there's additional pressure and difficulty in developing accounting estimates. In some cases, if management doesn't have the experience for complicated estimates, they may think about getting expertise from outside of the company. And then in addition to these complexities associated with developing estimates, I previously mentioned there could be increased opportunities to commit fraud. Fraud is certainly not new, but COVID has caused significant operational disruptions, which could result in increased pressure to commit fraud. Weakened internal control environments could create opportunities for fraud. Key control owners are working remotely, or perhaps they've been exited or furloughed. And if you combine that with situations where companies' supply chain and their customers may be struggling, you could get opportunities to create fraud. Companies typically have processes that are monitored by those charged with governance to identify and assess risks and ensure there are controls to prevent and detect misstatements. They will still need to assess this heightened risk of fraud and make sure their control environment mitigate the risks, including reevaluating the risk assessments throughout the year as circumstances might change. Finally, risk assessment should also address the other areas of the company that may be impacted by COVID to round out the full impact of the pandemic.
Thank you, Christine. Yulia, any additional observations from your perspective that you'd like to add in terms of what those charged with governance should be focused on around risk assessment?
Absolutely. I'm going to echo Christine's point quite a bit, I think, in my remarks, but I think it's really understanding the continuous changes to your business landscape. As we talked about it before, we had to modify some of the controls, and control environment was changing. So we really need to understand nature of changes, whether they're temporary or permanent changes, but that is an ongoing dialogue that we have to have and really have a 360 view of the business. It's not enough to only focus on one area and assume everything is status quo. We really need to see how each area impacts each other in the future and make sure that our risk assessment reflects that as well. And as I've mentioned earlier as well, more frequent risk assessments are critical so that we can timely react to changes and have appropriate risk coverage for our specific control environment. And the last point I wanted to make is I cannot continue to stress enough the communication point of all of this, right? So the communication amongst management, internal auditors, external auditors, and really being open for to finding solution that really works for everybody, right? Because it creates a lot of difficulties and complexities, and people are working remotely. There's a lot of stress on everybody. So working together and really identifying practical, workable solution is really what it's all about at the end of the day. So I would leave you with this message.
Well, this has been a very informative discussion and well-timed as auditors start to reassess some of these matters heading into calendar year end. So thank you, Christine and Yulia, for taking the time here to share your insights with us on this episode of Profession in Focus.